Sure. Thank you, Motomi. That was a very flattering introduction. Um, uh, and I'm glad to be back at Presidency. As I was just telling Zakir, I haven't been back there for nearly 20 years. Circumstances. I don't get to visit Calcutta very often these days, and that has had spillover effects. Uh, but I'm glad that I'm back, and thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. Now, just to sort of give you a background about where I'm coming from. One of the things, I think that a lot of the things that we sort of take for granted as economists. For example, institutions we took for granted for a long time, the legal systems we took for granted for a long time. And as a large number of researchers have demonstrated that actually we cannot take them as granted. I mean, they do exist and they do facilitate economic activities. However, they are carefully constructed. And my starting point is essentially that whatever we observe, whether it's an institution like property rights, whether it's the enforcement of contracts, whether it is sort of coming up with provision of public goods, for example, the agreements that we have, these are all constructs. And the question is, where do those constructs come from? Right? Because if they are constructs, they have been clearly been created. They're human creations, essentially. It doesn't come from any natural law or from any natural ordering. So where do we get them from? And that's sort of, in a sense, my starting point of interest in governance. Now, just to sort of starting off with a quote now. I'm not going to go through the quotations, obviously, but just to sort of tell you what Kaushik Basu had to say when he started talking about the social and political foundations of economics nearly 20 years ago. Basically argued that one of the things that we take for granted, just as we take property rights as granted, or rule of law as granted, and so on, is the government, right? And the government in economics is very often an exogenous variable. I remember my sort of undergraduate days when we talked about macroeconomics in particular. We would say that government taxes, government spends, and there's a government expenditure multipliers, etc., etc. When we talk about provision of public goods or in economic development context, very often we sort of talk about the government as if it's an exogenous sort of entity and a neutral entity, which actually is meant to do certain things and sort of maximizes social welfare or what have you. What Kaushik Basu points out is that actually they have their own agency, they have their own interest, right? And they are players in the game. And so essentially, they can actually shape the nature of the game itself, right? And I'm not yet connecting this to anything else that I have to say in the rest of the sort of my talk, but I just wanted to sort of highlight that this is how we are sort of trying to increasingly endogenize, in a sense, the entire structure within which economies operate, and how we are sort of focusing more and more on the players who, for a long time, we have been taking as exogenous, as taken for granted, and now we are trying to understand their behavior. We are trying to understand their agency. We are trying to understand how they influence the sort of structure within which we operate in an economy. So that is, sort of, again, the starting point of my interest in governance. Now, governance, if you think about it, there's been a huge increase in governance since, I would say, the mid-noughties, as I would say, right? Or maybe they're from the turn of the century, because if you go back to sort of the previous years, I'm sort of giving you some numbers from a 2009 paper by Dixit. You can see that there has been a huge increase over the last, let's say, few decades, right? Prior to that, there was not as much of a discussion about governance. Unfortunately, however, much of this discussion has taken place in the very narrow context of corporate governance, right? And we all know about that literature, especially if you are from the finance area. Much less has been discussed in the context of wider governance, as in how, for example, countries are governed, right? And yet, what the COVID-19 sort of pandemic, which we are still going through, has taught us is that a governance matters, right? So I'm sort of giving you a couple of sort of quotes from the Council of Europe and OECD. And again, without reading through the quotes, both of them say that uh, certain things, the COVID-19 crisis or pandemic has shown us that certain things are important, like provision of essential services, which we can essentially say that it's both the government service, but also maybe public goods in health, for example. And very importantly, and all the italics, all the things in italics are my doing. They have nothing to do with the Council of Europe or OECD or anybody else over here. So I have decided to highlight them and take sort of the responsibility for highlighting them. And the key issue is the trust in the authorities. And let me sort of expand on that trust bit a little bit over here before going into a bigger discussion about governance. So what about trust? So the first level of trust is the one that we will have on the government itself, which is that suppose we were to fall sick, suppose there were to be acceleration of the rate of infections, etc., that the government would do the needful, that they would sort of provide health services, that they would, if for people who do not have the ability to privately finance their healthcare, that there would be ability of the government and the willingness of the government to provide them with it, and so on and so forth. But there's also something that we sort of do not necessarily think through, but where also trust comes into play. So, for example, that if the government were to come and tell us that we all should wear masks, right? And then, of course, the question is that I have to now trust would, if I were to wear a mask, and somebody else doesn't wear it, maybe it's not going to work out as well. So I'd have to trust that the government is going to enforce this implicit contract between private individuals. So it's not just a relationship between the government and the citizens or the constituents of the country, but it's also the say, implicit contract that we have among the citizens that, well, I will wear a mask so that I do not sort of pass something on to you if I have it, and you will wear a mask so that I'm protected as well. So that contract, implicit contract, will also be sort of enforced by the government. And if somebody doesn't wear a mask, there'll be a penalty of some sort, etc., right? So trust has to operate at multiple different levels over here, right? So, and I just again wanted to highlight it as a sort of a start of a conversation about governance, because these things will come up later in the discussion. Just to give you some functional definitions now of government, and I've taken from two very different sources. One is the UNESCAP, and they simply say that it's a process. And I have highlighted the process. It was not in the original document. And they have given, UNESCAP have given 8 different dimensions of it, right? And you can see that there is participation, right? There is rule of law, which is the institutions bit. There is sort of issues about transparency, responsiveness, equity and inclusiveness, accountability, etc. Kaufman, on the other hand, talks about the government as a set of traditions and institutions, and by which the authority in a country is exercised. About, and again, I highlight 3 different things over here. The first question is, how are governments selected, monitored, and replaced? And herein, we talk
Professor
essentially
Bhaumik, could you
about,
hear us?
yes.
Seeing the slides, but we are still stuck on the first screen.
Oh, right. This is the bit, I'm just trying to understand how to, but that আমি তাই করছি, মানে আমি just
মেবি
slide
আপনি হ্যাঁ স্লাইড শো মোডে গেলে হয়তো হবে প্রবাবলি। হ্যাঁ,
আমি স্লাইড শো মোডেই আছি এখন, সেটার জন্যই আমি বুঝতে পারছি
না
না যে,
আমরা তো এখানে
আচ্ছা
টুলবারস দেখতে পাচ্ছি, সো হ্যাঁ,
এবার
না, নট ইয়েট।
এবার কি
এবার চেঞ্জ হয়েছে,
হ্যাঁ,
কিন্তু তার মানে ফার্স্ট টু, এটাতে দিস ওয়ান ইজ দ্য থার্ড ইউনিট ট্যাপ। আমরা ফার্স্ট দুটো স্লাইড দেখি,
কিন্তু আমরা ডিরেক্টলি ফোর্থ স্লাইডটা দেখতে পাচ্ছি।
ইয়েস।
আমি আবার পেছনে যাচ্ছি তাহলে। ইফ
হ্যাঁ
ইউ
হ্যাঁ
আমি এখান থেকে শুরু করেছিলাম। দিস ওয়াজ দ্য
হ্যাঁ
when I talked about Kaushik Basu and his take on how we view the government. তারপর আমি এখানে গেছিলাম যেখানে বলছিলাম যে দীক্ষিতের একটা পেপারে উনি বলেছেন যে গভর্নেন্স নিয়ে অনেক বেশি কথা হচ্ছে আগের তুলনায়, কিন্তু কর্পোরেট গভর্নেন্স অপেক্ষাকৃত বেশি আলোচিত হচ্ছে ইকোনমিক গভর্নেন্স বা মানে ওয়াইডার গভর্নেন্সের তুলনায়। আর তারপরে এই যে কাউন্সিল অফ ইউরোপ আর ওইসিডির দুটো উদ্ধৃতি এখানে দিয়েছি, যেটা এই কোভিড এর কনটেক্সটে গভর্নেন্স নিয়ে যে আবার নানা কথা উঠেছে আর কি। এবং তারপরে আমরা এই ফোর্থ স্লাইডে এসে পৌঁছেছিলাম
ওকে
যে
ওকে
ইউনেস্ক্যাপ আর কফম্যানের দুটো আলাদা টেক এইটার ব্যাপারে। তাতে going back to the sort of presentation again, so again to reiterate or to recap rather, because there was some sort of a problem with the slides moving through. The UNESCAP talks about governance as a process. It's about a process of decision making and as a process by which the decisions are implemented. Whereas Kaufman talks about three different things in the three different elements, which are the first is that how are governments selected, monitored, and replaced. So essentially, there is an accountability issue over here. Right, so there's a voice issue. For example, if it's a democratic process, then presumably the people have a voice, in the selection process. If not, then of course, if it's an authoritarian system, they may not have that voice. How are they monitored and replaced? So in other words, how are they accountable? So, we looked at the dimensions under UNESCAP. So once again, we talk about accountability over here. The second thing is the capacity of the government to formulate policies, right? So, what is the, like, for example, we talk about state capacity a lot, right? And this is where that kind of story comes in. Does the government have the monetary capacity? Do they have ever tax revenues, for example? And also, do they have the capacity in terms of the right people, etc., in order to deliver something? And finally, and this is again a very key issue, the respect of the citizens, right? So we talked about trust. If we go back to one of the previous slides, and one of the things that I had highlighted was that there has to be a certain amount of trust in the government, right? In the trust in the authorities, right? In order for good governance to take place. And here we are once again talking about something related, perhaps not really trust, but certainly a respect, which essentially means that there is a legitimacy, right? So, for example, if I were to say that there is a certain state, right, which has no legitimacy because of a certain action by one of the individuals which participates in the government. And I'll give you a concrete example. If you follow the UK political discourse, you'd note that a few months ago, one of the special advisors to the British Prime Minister was accused of violating the social distancing and the lockdown rules, right? And what has happened since is that there is an argument that because somebody in the government in a position of power had violated that sort of the lockdown rules, and that therefore, and the government essentially defended that person and said, this was not particularly wrong, and there's nothing, this person shouldn't resign, etc., etc. So there has been an argument subsequently, and I don't know where the empirics come from. I'm not going to vouch for the empirics, but there's certainly an argument that this has led to a scenario where essentially the person on the street is saying that, well, if the government person or the government advisor can violate the lockdown rules, so can we. Why are we any different from them, right? So here there's a loss of respect in a particular context, or a loss of legitimacy of the government, and that therefore they may find it more difficult to sort of provide governance in the context of COVID-19. Right. So again, I'm not going to sort of overstress how much or this has mattered, or exactly what role this has played. But this is certainly a discussion that is ongoing in the political domain within the UK. And so I thought I'll give you that as an example. And both of these, the UNESCAP has 8 dimensions, Kaufman has 6 dimensions, and you can see there is a lot of overlap between the two. Rule of law, is there in both. You can talk about voice and accountability on the one hand. You can talk about participation, which is, part of the story about voice, as I said. So there is participation in the UNESCAP story, voice and accountability in the Kaufman et al. Story, and right. So they are roughly similar. They're not exactly the same, but they're roughly similar. These elements, right? Now, the challenge, of course, is that we can come up with these characterizations, right, or dimensions of governance and good governance, but there would always be arguments against them, right? So, I borrowed some from Margaret Levy. This is an excellent book of rules and revenue, one of the first that talks about governments, in my opinion. And just to give you some examples corruption. So is there if we say that corruption is an abuse of public power for private gain, is there a consistent definition of that? So for example, if you look at the literature by Rose Ackerman and the others on corruption, they talk about that in certain contexts, such as, in say, emerging markets or developing countries, to people in exchange for a service provided is part of the cultural ethos. I mean, it has been going on for a long time because the nature of relationships are, these are relationship-based exchanges that happen in these countries, not necessarily purely transaction-based. Right. And in a relationship, people give gifts. Right. Now, that is not necessarily seen as corruption or as abuse of power, but it is accepted. So do we have a consistent definition of control of corruption across the world? Secondly, when we come to clientelism, nepotism, etc., where I may not benefit directly, or my family members may not benefit either, but let's say that I do it for my kind of people, and that my kind of people could be a particular ethnic group, it could be people of a particular religion or a particular caste or a particular, any sort of identity that I can think of, that I sort of bend the rules or whatever in order to benefit a particular group of people with whom I identify. Right. Now, if that's the case, is that strictly speaking, so I'm basically favoring one group over another. I'm not gaining personally, but my group or the group with which I identify is benefiting. The question is that abuse of power for private gain? Right, because it's about a wider group over here. It is not clear, right? So there are a few questions that come up. Rule of law, similarly, is rule of law necessarily rule of good law? Because it can be a bad law, right? So if you have, let's say, a colonial government, for example, they may essentially have laws which are patently against the native population, right? So if these laws are enforced and they're enforced equally, right? So all native people, they are subjected to the law and the treatment is exactly the same, but it just happens to be a bad law. Should we go for that? Right? And so, what is sort of rule of law in that case? Should rule of law be enforced equally irrespective of circumstances? So, for example, there is this lot of debate that is going on currently in the US context. And a particular example that has come up is that somebody has apparently been, jailed for life for what, at least from the media report, seems to be a relatively a minor crime. So now, suppose I have this scenario where I come up with a law and say, okay, I give you 2 or 3 chances, but if you sort of commit felony for twice or thrice, I don't care about the nature of the felony, but that means you go to jail for life. Right? Suppose that's the law in the land, right? And for one person, felony may be really a big thing, armed robbery or whatever. For another person, a felony might be petty theft. Right. So if that's the kind of difference, should we apply the law exactly in the same way? Right. Or do we have to define a very, very exact contract, as the Romans apparently used to do, which is where I say, for petty theft it's this, for a bigger theft it's something else, and I sort of have a very, very well-defined contract. And as we know, that's rather difficult, right? Because we have to then sort of think through every possible form of felony have a special sort of punishment for each individual sort of type of felony and so on, which will become unmanageable at some point, right? So we have to have generalities, but if we were to sort of blindly apply the law equally to everybody, we may come up with scenarios where the implementation of the law itself may be questioned, right? So again, what is rule of law? And remember, I'm essentially telling you sort of where the literature, where the scholars have gone with it. This is sort of in part being playing devil's advocate, partly on their behalf, partly on mine. And so I'm not saying that rule of law shouldn't exist. All I'm saying is, there are issues that we have to think through. Similarly, we talk about democracy. Now, Fukuyama, if you read his book, 2011 book, he sort of gives an example where there's this group of people who have traditionally been ruled by their tribal sort of chieftains, right? And the nature of the relationship was that the chief was a benevolent person. They basically everybody did the bidding of the chief, and the chief provided them with benefits in some form or the other. Now, there were these different tribes, different sort of chiefs, and then national democracy was created, a national parliament was formed, and there was voting, etc. So from each group, the people voted for their chiefs, right? And everybody went to the parliament. But suddenly, when you go to the parliament, if you then say that, well, I want money to build a bridge in my constituency, but there's no need for a bridge. We know that there are these discussions about bridge to nowhere and pork belly kind of expenditures by the government. And but yeah, from an economic efficiency point of view, that doesn't make any sense, right? From an accountability point of view for the national government, it possibly doesn't make any sense. But the people suddenly got confused. They said, okay, we sent you to the parliament in order to get these goodies for us, right? You are accountable to us because we voted for you. But you are not getting it for us because you say that it is not possible in this new system. So here is the scenario. If you have the accountability of the representatives in the parliament at the national level and accountability of the constituents who want the goodies, right? And they have expressed their voice in that particular way. How do I balance them, right? Where does the balance come about? And then if you look at democracy also as in the context of political and economic transition, would there necessarily be good governance, right? So for example, if you have Eastern Central Europe, and I don't know, many of you may not know that I spent a couple of years in Eastern Central Europe at one point in time during the peak of the transition period. And yeah, governance was weak, let's put it that way, right? Now, the thing is, had come in, right? Because that was part of the transition process, right? So we have democracy, but precisely because they had moved to democracy from a system, right, which was not particularly good, perhaps, but it was some kind of an equilibrium, and sort of people operated within that equilibrium, and then suddenly there was a change, a move to democracy, and the state didn't have sufficient capacity to operate. People didn't have sufficient trust. The governments did not necessarily have sufficient legitimacy, so governance was not happening, right? So the question is, do we blindly look at democracy as an indicator of, or as a manifestation of good governance, or as a correlate of good governance, or should we think about the context? Are you sort of in a process of transition? Are you a mature democracy, and so on and so forth, right? Finally, we talk about government efficiency, and we can talk about government efficiency different ways, and we normally talk about government efficiency in a good way, that they can deliver public goods efficiently, for example. But we also know that governments have a monopoly over violence, at least in most cases, right? If it's not a failed state, then generally it does have a monopoly over violence. That's how it's looked at, right? Now, suppose they were to have a fairly brutal police and military system, and and they very efficiently tackle crime through that, right? So basically, something happens, you commit a crime, you're basically shot. There's no criminal or no perceived criminal, and the crime stops, right? Now, is that necessarily good governance? They're very good at it. right? The question is that necessarily good for the is that good governance rather, right? Now, these are the kinds of questions that come up repeatedly, right? And so this sort of makes quantifying governance quite difficult because all these questions are raised. Now, having sort of said all this, ironically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and use some metrics which are possibly subjected to many of the criticisms that I have sort of highlighted over here, simply because if we have to sort of have any discussion, it's good to look at some data, it's good to look at some numbers, and even if the numbers are not perfect, if that's the best what we have to sort of try to make do with those numbers, right? So here are some numbers that sort of I can highlight. Let me get to the next point. Here we are. Um, Now, what I did is I took this data from the Kaufman et al. World Governance Indicators of the World Bank. So what I've done here is that, on the top, I've chosen a couple of indicators because there are 6, and I didn't want to go through all 6 for the sake of time. So I've chosen voice and accountability, and I've chosen, as you'll see later, rule of law. So the first thing that you observe over here is that most of the world is actually red or pink, which basically means not particularly good governance. So, a very small part of the world is green, which sort of talks about good governance, either deep green or light green. And the other thing is, over an 18-year period, nothing much has changed. So you will see that there have been a few changes at the margin if you talk about sort of a move from yellow to pink or pink to yellow or red to pink and so on and so forth. But you do not see countries breaking into the green zone. Right. So the question is, okay, there is a bit of a persistence, perhaps, right? In sort of what kind of governance we have, because remember, 18 years is, you can say that in the history of a country, it's a blink. It's a blink of an eye. You sort of, 18 years is nothing. But on the other hand, if you talk about enacting of laws, if you talk about sort of creating certain formal institutions like property rights, if you talk about creating mechanisms to enforce contracts, at least private contracts, these things can be done over an 18-year period. I mean, if you take the Central and Eastern European countries as a case in point, they created these entire structures within a much shorter period of time. Right. But what we find is that, therefore, one conclusion is that it may be easier to sort of create certain formal institutions, but doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to necessarily have good governance, over the same period of time, that you can shift from a relatively weak governance to good governance over that period of time, right? And again, if I give you the data on the rule of law, you will find that the patterns are pretty similar over here. And you can try it out with the other things. You will find that this sort of happens across many of the others as well. The next thing that I want to give you is sort of a distribution. So here I gave you a map because at the end of the day, picture is sort of, to go for the cliche, it's worth 1,000 words. Now here we sort of give you certain distributions. So one thing that you observe, if you look at the panel on the left, is that, for both voice and accountability, I've chosen those two, as I said, and rule of law. You will find that there's quite a bit of variation, across the countries. Now, when we shift to the ones on the right, the graphs on the right, these are kernel distributions, you will find that there is a clear difference between the ones which are upper income countries, right, and the other countries. So for example, if you compare between 96 and 2016, 1996 was the first year when this data became available. 2016 is the latest year for which we have the data. Now, so if you look at those two periods of time, we can see some movements in the other countries, right? So for example, if you look at voice and accountability, we can see that there may have been some movement in the low-income countries. There is greater voice, perhaps, and there is some sort of convergence in the averages, let's say, of the low-income, low middle income, and the upper middle income countries. But upper income countries are a group apart, right? And it's the same with the rule of law, right? So that is sort of essentially telling you the same story that the maps told us. Because as I said, going back to the maps, that all the green countries are essentially the developed countries, right? Now, we don't have any causality over here as yet, right? It's a whether sort of governance leads to better sort of state of the development or not. Remember, these countries were developed even much before this time period that we are considering over here. So, but nevertheless, it's very difficult to talk about causality. Give you some specific examples. So here I have chosen 4 countries in particular. So the UK is a developed country, Brazil is a upper middle income, Tunisia is a lower middle income, and Nepal is a low income. And once again, you see that there are sort of small changes. So if you take Tunisia as a case in point, what we find is that between 96 and 2016, Tunisia does slightly better in terms of voice and accountability, but slightly worse in terms of political stability. Right. And, if you think about the Arab Spring and, what happened in Tunisia, there was a flux in the government. So that may have affected the political stability over there. But the Arab Spring may have led to greater voice and accountability. But much of those changes for those countries are sort of at the margin. So they're small changes, right? Relative to what has happened in the UK. So the UK among these 4 countries remains an outlier, right? So again, reiterating that these are cross-sectional differences, but it's rather sort of difficult apparently within a 16, 20 year period to sort of get to a good governance state, right? And somehow the developed countries are there. So now let's take a look at the Eastern and Central European countries and the ones of the former Soviet republics. And these are interesting because they had different histories in the past, obviously. But then for a long period of time, they were part of a monolithic, but let's say, relative to the rest of the world, certainly similar political and economic structures, some less than others, because you know that the Czechoslovakia and Hungary entered the Soviet bloc much later than the others, but there were sort of other countries like, say, Bulgaria, for example, which have been there in the Soviet bloc for a long time, as were the former Soviet republics. But if you look at them, you will find that they have very different sort of levels of governance. I'm once again choosing voice and accountability, and in the next slide, the rule of law as the 2 different indicators or dimensions of governance. The other thing that you observe is that the patterns are very different as well. So if you observe in the Eastern and Central European countries, which are to the left of my screen, you will find that they were slightly higher levels compared to, say, some of the other countries like Tajikistan and the others, or Uzbekistan, and they sort of remain broadly flat. Nothing much changed, right? Since the 1995, which is sort of the middle of 5 years or so after the start of the transition process, mid-90s, nothing much has changed since then. Hungary has had a decline in voice and accountability. We know that story already. That a lot has been talked about the populist governments and the implications of that for governance and voice and accountability, in particular in the Hungarian case. You look at the Soviet republics, on the other hand, things can go in different directions. So Georgia is doing rather well, whereas in certain other countries, like in this case Russia, things are going in the wrong direction, right? It's declining in voice and accountability. If you look at, now the rule of law, it's somewhat similar. Now, in rule of law, you find that actually for the Eastern Central European countries, things are improving slightly because they start from a slightly better position than the former Soviet republics, but things are moving up a little bit, right? And you can question that you can ask yourself is this the sort of the EU effect? Because they are, they were going to become part of the EU, and then they did become part of the EU, whether this is where sort of the rule of law, is being influenced by that external factor. Whereas for the former Soviet republics, again, Georgia is doing relatively well, but you can see for the others, it's a bit up and down. There's no particular pattern over here, right? Promise I'll sort of bring it all together. There are a lot of graphs that I'm sort of plowing through for the sake of time, but I'll sort of bring it to some conclusion at some point in time. This is where what I've done is I've essentially drawn a 45-degree line, and I've sort of said, okay, where if I were to plot voice and accountability in 1996 and 2016, similarly rule of law in 1996 and 2016, where would that dots lie? The scatters points lie relative to the 45-degree line. And as we know that, if the rule of law hasn't changed, or the voice and accountability hasn't changed during over this 20-year period, you'd be lie on the 45-degree line, right? Now, what we find is that that's not quite the case. There are some countries where that is indeed the case, right? But in many cases where you sort of either do much better, you improve relative to 1996, or in some cases you go backwards. So, for example, Hungary is arguably a country which has gone backwards in terms of voice and accountability, whereas if you look at, let's say, Georgia, the one we're looking at, they have certainly improved considerably since 1996. So what I finally did is, with all this, I said, okay, let me do a simple cluster analysis, right? And I said, okay, let's sort of say that, suppose I were to try to divide this, countries into 5 different clusters, right? And what would I see? So this is 1996, and what I want to highlight is that the countries in green, these are all these sort of Western European countries. These are sort of the developed world ones, right? And that cohort are in a group of their own, right? And that remains the case even 20 years later, right? There are movements, in among other countries. So, for example, if you look at this, Bulgaria, Romania, and HRV is Croatia. So you can see what has happened. They were earlier sort of clubbed with certain other countries. For example, you can see Bulgaria and Romania were more similar to Ukraine and Russia and Moldova and so on and so forth. But then they sort of become improve slightly, and they become a group of their own, and they're sort of over here, they're a group of their own. In certain other cases, what you find is that certain countries like like the Czech Republic and the others, they are of a group of their own over here, and not again, they are very similar, right? The Central European countries. So there is a clear hierarchy of sorts, right? So the older Western European countries, which were developed by this time, and they remain in terms of governance. And remember, we are not talking about development over here. We are talking about the dimensions of governance. They remain a group of their own. Countries, other countries have been able to sort of break through over here, right? In a way. There is some movement among the other countries, right? And there's a hierarchy. So what we find is that typically the former Soviet republics are in a group of their own. Then we find that the central sort of European countries like the Czech Republic and Poland, and they are a group of their own, and they are sort of similar to the weaker, in a sense, the West European states, for example, the Southern European ones like Greece, right, which we know have had numerous problems in terms of both their economy and governance over the last, say, 20, 25 years. Italy, for example, is another case in point. So these are sort of like the weaker Western European countries. We find that Slovenia, interestingly, from the very start, even in 1996, SVN in Slovenia, it has been similar to many of the Western European countries, right? Like for example, Belgium, BEL is Belgium, or Spain, ESP, etc. Right? So they are similar to that, right? Which also raises another interesting point. Now, here we have a scenario where Yugoslavia was, it's a federation. It was a federation, and it was, but it was unified country in a sense, right? And it had Slovenia, it had Serbia, it had Croatia, Bosnia Herzegovina, Kosovo, etc., etc. Now, what we find is that after the sort of breakup, right, what we find is that somehow, if the Serbia and the others are not over here, whereas Slovenia straight away goes to the sort of the level of governance which is consistent with that of Belgium or Portugal or Spain and so on. That is not necessarily the case with the other parts of the Yugoslav states and the former Yugoslav republics. Question is why? right? They were part of the similar political and economic system for a long, long time. Yes, they had different histories. If we go back, before the Yugoslavia pre-Tito times, obviously they had different histories, but wasn't uh, multiple decades, 40, 50 years of staying together in the same system, wasn't it enough to sort of have some kind of an equalization of governance patterns across these countries? Why is it that whatever was, the differences, earlier, assuming that these what we observe now are the manifestations of those pre-Yugoslavia differences, why are they still manifest? Why do they still exist? These are questions that I'm raising questions. I'm not sort of necessarily providing an answer over here, but I just thought that it's interesting to make note of some of those things. So here I sort of, bring things together. And what we observe is that, there's a very, large cross-sectional variances. There are clear hierarchies. And importantly, it's rather sort of difficult to sort of get to the highest level of governance. There's a huge amount of persistence over there. Right. Now, there are some modest changes, right? But as I said, very a large degree of persistence. And also what we don't understand necessarily is that given that these countries have had very different histories, very different sort of pathways that they have taken, right, over time, is there a unique sort of pathway to a good governance, right? Or is it that you can get there in many different ways? There are many different pathways. It's just that there are you have to meet certain necessary conditions along each pathway. Can we talk about that? Can we say anything about that? It's not clear from the numbers and the graphs, etc., that we have looked at. Now, let us sort of now try to sort of widen up. We have now seen the data. Let's now sort of start talking about come back to the conceptual basis of governance and start talking about the sort of the different perspectives. Some view, that governance signifies the structure of formal and informal institutions. So, Besley and Maitrish have an excellent paper, which I think you should look at. It's a Handbook of Development Economics paper. It's available on LSE's website. And they sort of talk about how the property rights come up, why are they revised, etc. I'll talk, however, about the Hoff and Stiglitz paper. So, because it has salience for what I'm going to talk about next. So, Hoff and Stiglitz say that, if you talk about the Eastern Central European countries, that privatization happened, and we all know that property rights, were legislated upon, and they sort of trying to sort of bring about sanctity of property rights in those countries. But in certain countries it worked, in certain other countries it didn't. Right, and the simplest example is that in certain countries there was a huge amount of expropriation of the or cannibalization of the state assets, right, just before they were being privatized, or even after they were privatized. Right. In certain other contexts, that didn't happen. Now, why is that the case? Now, Hoff, who is a political, is a political science person, Carla Hoff, and Stiglitz is an economist. They bring this into a perspective, together, and they say, okay, look, what happens is, suppose you are in a country where you sort of decide that yes, they have enacted some legislations, they have privatized the properties, that is all good and fine, but they're never going to enforce this. I know that they're never going to do it, right? I know it, he knows it, or she knows it, and I know that he knows and she knows that I knows and he knows, this kind of the kind of game theoretic arguments that you make, and you say that, okay, therefore it doesn't really matter, I can expropriate, there is no real penalty for this. Right, because this is the norm. This is what everybody has signed up to. That legislation about privatization or that legislation about property rights doesn't really matter. Right. In that case, it could become a self-fulfilling prophecy whereby you sort of end up with a scenario that there's a huge amount of expropriation, right? And de facto, property rights sanctity doesn't hold. Whereas in other contexts, if you start from beginning and say, well, there must be some sanctity because the government has enacted this and people possibly believe in this, right? And so there could be a penalty if I were to expropriate. Chances are that there'll be much less expropriation in that case. So once again, what we are getting to is that these belief systems matter. right? When we start talking about whether certain formal institutions, for example, work or not, right? The next, it could be a process. And remember that when we talked about the UNESCAP sort of definition, it was talking about a process. In part, it could be a discussion about state capacity. I'm not going to elaborate on that because there's a lot of talk about state capacity, especially in the context of the current pandemic. So you, I'm sure, familiar with that, but there is that kind of a story. Then there is a question about mechanisms, right? It's a mechanisms about institutional procedures of decision making and control, right? And the first part, which is about decision making, it's essentially a question about political economy, right? And you know the political economy literature that how does government come up with particular set of policies, right? Also with a particular set of institutions, right? Who are like policy could be that do I sort of free up trade? Grossman and Helpman, for example, talked about do I have trade liberalization? Do I sort of allow FDI into the country? Political economy of that. Besley talks about, for example, the restraints on government on the other hand, right? How do you put restraints on governments? Calomiris and Haber, it's an excellent book again from Princeton University Press, and you should read that. They talk about how fragility of the financial systems were actually created, right? They are part of a sort of a bargaining process among the rulers of the particular country and the constituents of the particular of that country, and so it's a political economy process. So it's a political economy and the restraints on the government. Margaret Levy, whom I have cited in the past in one of the previous slides, talks about how rulers decide on optimal revenue production, which is taxation, right? Because Levy has a particular take on this. Levy basically says that what governments want to do is always maximize the revenue they generate and use it presumably to their private ends. And the question is, how do the constituents or the citizens sort of impose restraints on them so that they cannot, either overtax them or sort of misuse the tax revenue once it's generated, right? So that kind of a story. But now we come down to the Kaushik Basu story. The one that we started with that quotation. It is a strategy that signifies the actor's effort to govern and to manipulate the design of institutions, right? So now it is not just, for example, when we talk about political economy, very often, the government is there, the Helpman and Grossman, for example, they say that the government's objective function is, in a sense, the sort of the tax revenue that it generates, and in some sense, the aggregated welfare of the everybody else in the economy, and so on and so forth, right? Now, but it's still relatively passive in a sense, right? But the question is, how does the government sort of create the mechanism? So, how do I, for example, know that it is possible to influence the government through taxation or through, political donations? Like, for example, in the US, there's a huge discussion around the ability of individual donors and corporate donors and the others to actually make political donations with presumably consequences for the way that policies are designed over there. Now, this is clearly a design, right? And then that there is this, landmark Supreme Court case in the US where it was said that, corporations, they can, like big political action groups, they can be treated as, individuals, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not a lawyer. I have to sort of beg your, forbearance for misstating certain legal aspects of things when I try to get into it. But generally speaking, it sort of made it easier for larger groups to make these political contributions. But that is not the case in certain other contexts. That kind of political contributions is not allowed, permitted by law, by constitution, etc., etc. But constitution is a construct. Law is a construct, right? So why is it allowed in certain cases legally? Why is it not allowed in certain other cases legally? Why does a certain context make it easier for constituents to influence the policy making process and institutions making process? Why does it make it difficult in certain other contexts? Right. So, this is what essentially I think Basu was trying to get at, which is that the governments themselves have agency, they have their own interest, right? And they can sort of shape, in a sense, the environment in which we operate right? And once you've created that environment, then of course, you either have a scenario, as I was saying, where political donations are perfectly legal. In other cases, it is illegal, right? And so the extent to which you can influence government decisions will also vary, right? Um, so but it's also the question of what are the interests of the rulers. That's what defines it. Are the rulers' principles acting on their own behalf, which is what where we are getting at with this Kaushik Basu story, or are they simply sort of acting on behalf of powerful constituents, which is part of where the political economy literature goes. Who are their constituents, right? For example, there's this literature in law and economics and law and finance domain, which sort of says that, look, whether or not we have laws that make help develop a stock market may depend on the median voter in the economy, and that it depends on whether the median voter is, let's say, an entrepreneur, or whether the a median voter is a rentier with a lot of surplus capital which the rentier wants to invest, whether it's a landowning class, for example, right? Now, it may matter what is the identity of this median voter, right? So who are these constituents? What are their interests? And there, as you can see, history has a role to play, because whether we end up at any given point in time with a large set of, let's say, landowning people or landless people or rentier class, etc., history has a large, has a long shadow in a sense, right? So let us now try to sort of lay the foundations of what I call an integrated narrative. I mean, it would be too presumptuous of me to say, theory. I don't think what I'm trying to get at is theory in the classical sense of what economic theory is, but I'm trying to get to an integrated narrative, right? So we can say that there are at least two different elements that of governance, right? One is creation of the rules of the game or the institutions and enforcing these rules, and then and that has sort of longer term sort of implications, but it is also about designing policies and addressing market failures, providing public goods, distribution of output, which are the kinds of things that Tim Besley, for example, talks about, right? What is failure of governance or failure of government. Then we start also sort of talking about the design and the enforcement of the rules. They depend on a lot of things, especially the design, right? It depends on the strength of the state, and this is the legitimacy, right? I do not necessarily mean that the state has the military or the policing ability to force things down our throats. It basically means that are we able to accept it? Are we willing to accept it? What the state is going to do, right? I was told a story, and I cannot sort of verify this because I'm not completely up to date with the history of Ireland. But I visited Ireland for a workshop some years ago, and we were discussing taxation, right? And one of the things that I was told that there's a sort of ambiguity about the sort of sanctity of taxation in many quarters, because remember that there was the British state and the sort of raise taxation to what end? To sustain a colonial state, right? And that sort of muddies waters up, right? Again, I must say that I do not know enough about the history of that country to sort of say, yes, this is indeed the case, or no, that it is not the case. I'm just sort of telling you what I was told by scholars out there. And whereas I cannot talk about Ireland, I can certainly say that that would be the case in perhaps many other parts of the world. So legitimacy is a case in point, nature of the rulers, and also their legitimacy over here, right? The nature of the constituents, and what are the sort of mechanisms that are feasible if we want to constrain the rulers? What are the mechanisms that are feasible in certain contexts, right? And from there we move to the next one, and this is there's an excellent two-volume book by Ken Binmore. He makes a very interesting point and a very powerful point. He says that, look, what we very often say is that there's a social contract of some sort, right? And that social contract essentially determines how we sort of design institutions in a particular context, how we sort of do distribution, how we sort of provide public goods, and so on and so forth. And we sort of say that, yeah, so this has to be enforced in a certain way, and the mechanisms are there to ensure that actually, this is how we are going to enforce it. But there are problems with that argument, right? And the problems with that argument are that, for example, when we say that there are property rights, that's an institution, and we'll enforce it. Suppose we say we are going to enforce it by rule of law, by courts, by police, right? Now, remember that in a country, the vast majority of people in a developing country, for example, do not own any property, right? So a minority of people own property, and their property rights are sort of being sort of the sanctity of their property rights depends on the forbearance of the people who don't. Because if those people were to essentially say that, well, I don't own any property, I'm unlikely to ever own a property. So, why do I care about your property rights? I'm going to squat on your land, go do what you want. Right? What are you going to do about it? Right? So there is that aspect of it. Yeah, sure. না এখন না এখনো সরাইনি আমি হ্যাঁ ওটা চলছে yeah so similarly when we talk about democracy there is an implicit argument that there's a transfer of power bloodlessly opposing party accepts that the other party has won at least for the next 4 or 5 years agree to govern on everybody's behalf. When that breaks down, if there's a majoritarian government, for example, or for example, I was talking to a journalist friend about the US some time ago. He's a US citizen. He said that, look, a lot of things about the way things happen in the US is essentially by a gentleman's agreement. It's because everybody accepts it, that this is the way things ought to be done. The moment somebody comes in and decides not to do things that way, things may start breaking down, right? Now, so there we are. Now, I'll not go through this slide for the sake of time. This is an example of how economists in particular have thought about governance. This is a Dixit Econometrica paper from 2003. But what I would like to highlight, however, is that the question that Dixit raises, that is there a common system of governance? Right, that there are there multiple equilibria? Do we have is there a common system of governance that we see in all equilibria, or are there sort of differences? How do those different equilibria with different governance structures come up? Right, so we have to address those questions. Right, so there's no sort of one big sort of good governance, etc. story. We can see good governance, perhaps. Rather, we can sort of understand this is good governance, perhaps where we can see it, or when we perhaps have the data for it. The question is, how do we get there? Right? It's not that obvious. Now, what I would like to introduce into the discussion as the last thing that I'm going to do, and I'm sorry really for sort of overstepping my time limit. I promise to sort of wrap it up within the next 2 to 5 minutes. One thing that we haven't talked about is the nature of the state, right? Yet the state and has two different angles. The first issue is that the state has to have legitimacy, as we have seen in this story. Where does the legitimacy of the state come from? Right? The second issue is that a state and the rulers of the political elite, right? How do we know, the nature of the political elite, right? So for example, if you start from a natural state thousands of years ago, then what we essentially find, if you follow the North et al. Kind of argument, is that they sort of take the, in a sense, I think, a Hobbesian view of the world, which is that there's violence everywhere. There is the natural state is sort of terrible in a way, and but then you sort of start evolving from there, right? And first there is some kind of a coalition among elites, right? The powerful elites in a particular context, and they say, okay, we come to an agreement among ourselves that we are not going to fight with each other, at least not in a like not just kill each other, right? And then we sort of decide on the rules of the game to share power, or at least to transfer power periodically from one to the other. And then what we shall do is we shall protect the people, the rest of the citizens who are maybe not the part of the elite, from external forces. They will protect themselves perhaps from each other, and that would be the starting point or the basis of the the contract with them, right? Now the question is, do they have the legitimacy? There's these elites that do these sort of the other citizens sort of look at them, and say, yes, we are going to, they have set the rules and we are going to go with these rules, right? And that is the basis of our state, right? There's a question of whether these rules are only between the state and the elites and the constituents, or the ruled, or one of the citizens, whatever you choose to call them, or do the rules also define the relationships between private citizens, right? How evolved is that scenario? So in a way, sort of, are we saying that I am being safeguarded and my property rights are being safeguarded because I'm part of some kind of a political coalition, and I'm part of the sort of the state coalition, or I have a friend in the state, or I'm part of the ethnic group that is part of this, that is sort of dominant in the state? Or is it that my property rights, which is the basics of my sort of transactions with other private sort of individuals or private citizens, whether that is sort of sanctioned by sort of a set of private rules, right? And North et al. Talk about public ordering, which is the relationship between the state and the ruling elite with the rest, and also private ordering, which determines how contracts are going to be enforced, how transactions will happen between sort of the private citizens who are not part of the elite, right? And one of the things that they say is that if you look at the three levels over here, so this is the fragile natural state and the basic natural state and the sort of mature states, this transition doesn't happen sort of very easily. And in fact, there's nothing to say that the transition would only happen in one direction. You can always fall, you can always slide back, as we saw in some of the examples of governance that looked at Eastern Central Europe. Certain countries have improved over time since mid-90s. Certain other countries have not. They have gone in the other direction, right? So once again, there is some kind of a story over here. Now, what I therefore would like to summarize over here is what the integrated narrative that I'm trying to sort of get at is that I'm trying to understand, not quite the natural state, because, can't go back thousands of years, not a historian, not trained to be a historian, but essentially where do they come from? And, the natural state, the events and the path dependence, that we have associated with sort of history. The question is, do they shape, for example, the issues such as the informal rules of the game? What are the rules that are acceptable to the people, right? Remember that, as Binmore has been pointing out, that all the contracts that we have socially have to be self-enforceable. Because if they're not, if certainly one group of people say, well, I don't really care, I'm going to not sort of deviate from this, it is not clear what mechanism you have to sort of enforce that contract, short of maybe fighting a civil war, which can be, terribly expensive in many different ways. Right, so there's a self enforcement element over there. Berkowitz, Katerina Pistor, and some others, and I think Richards, they show that in fact, when you enact a law in a country, that law works only if the elements of the law, or what the law is trying to sort of ensure, or sort of is already there. There's an acceptance for that in the country in an informal way. Right. So clearly, this informal aspects, the norms, these kinds of things matter. The nature of the rulers matter. The history and the natural state and the evolution from that will tell us who the rulers are. Who are the first people who essentially came out and said, okay, we will first sort of strike an agreement among ourselves. We will protect the rest, and we will therefore eventually become the ruling class. Who are they, right? Who are these people? Who are the constituents? Are they agrarian sort of people? Are they sort of frontiers? Are they the commercial class? Who are these people, right? What do we know from that, right? How do specific events change things? Events like the Second World War, right, which may have shaped, arguably, and people argue have shaped the sort of the kind of welfare state-based social contracts that we have in Europe, in large parts of Europe. So, what roles do those kinds of events play? And then we essentially argue is that, okay, there are the rulers, not one person. There are groups of people who have different sets of contracts among themselves. There are the constituents, and they could be isolated, or they could be also be in groups, right? And they could act in groups. They come together, and we can sort of say it's either a bargaining, or it's some kind of a contract, a developing of other ways to develop contract, and they form a contract. Now, the contract depends on many things. So, for example, it depends on transaction costs, which, as you know, is how easy or costly is it for me to ensure that there is no holdup post a contract, because I don't want holdups, right? So what mechanism is there to ensure that that won't happen, right? And remember that this transaction cost in turn depends on the nature of the contract, because you can design sort of mechanisms through which to influence the transaction cost itself. So it's a two-way process. And then, of course, there are the discount rates. So if I'm the ruler or the set of rulers, then am I sort of trying to make a very quick buck, like, and expropriate everything in the country because I know that I have 5 years timeline to expropriate and go out? Or am I here for the long run, in which case I'll have a repeated interaction with these constituents, and the sort of repeated game kind of a story kicks in, and then there's a perhaps a different way that I design the contract, or try to design the contract, right? So this is sort of where I'm at. And what I'm trying to answer is this set of questions over here. And I'm trying to do them in the context of Eastern Central Europe, largely because I have greater access to data. I've spent some time over there, so I do have some kind of some people that I know who I can talk to. There's been enough research within Europe about the sort of transition process and the past histories of Eastern Central Europe. So I have sort of people to talk to, and so these are the questions that I'm trying to answer in that particular context. Again, sorry for overstepping my time, and this is where we are. I guess here again, the question, Joyte, am I mistaken in saying that your question has an element of causality in it? I mean, are you suggesting that if you sort of adopt democracy, then you necessarily end up with more voice and accountability?
Yeah,
If
that's
it's
what I'm
if
asking for. And what does the data show? Test it out.
well, see, empirical evidence shows that in many cases there is, but again, the question is how the definition of democracy again becomes slightly uh, difficult to quantify. For example, if you take Hungary as a case in point, in a nominal sense, it is a democracy. Elections have taken place, right? And but what has happened is that uh, in that country, we find that voice and accountability has declined over time. And more importantly, what seems to have happened over there is that there is an element of a majoritarian rule, whereas the interests of a certain group of people or citizens or voters within the country is being protected, perhaps to the detriment of the others in the country, right? Which is not quite consistent with the spirit of democracy, in the sense that in a spirit of democracy, everyone should be have the same amount of voice or representation, etc., etc. Right? So if you look at the empirical evidence, and perhaps by and large, if you look at very extreme cases like uh, a well-established mature democracy at the one end, and a very sort of new and maybe a fragile democracy at the other end, maybe there are sort of clear differences. If you talk about the differences between, say, the Russia and Germany, for example, they would find considerable differences over there. But the question is, if you look at in the intermediate stage, if we talk about nominally being democratic in the sense that people go and cast their votes, it is not clear necessarily whether that would necessarily lead to an improvement in voice and accountability. At least that's what the data seems to suggest. And that's how I sort of look at the data.
Yes, yes. First of all, thank you, and thank you, Sumon. Lovely talk, and apologies that I missed the first 15, 20 minutes. My question is rather broad. I'm not an expert at all. You explained why you focused on specific group of European countries, and you also explained why your focus is after 1996. But of course, this then opens up other scenarios. For example, Commonwealth comes to mind. So if you focus on Commonwealth and perhaps French colonies in Africa, then I don't know how to compare them with Eastern European countries, but all I'm saying is, you touched on this, all I'm saying is big events like colonization or World War may have a huge impact, which perhaps, and also for Eastern European cases, let's say they were former Soviet countries. So I think these probably have uh, a big effect. I'm sure you are aware of that, but I thought if you could focus on other sets of countries, what your views will be.
No, certainly. I mean, I'm sure that would, and again, it would be immensely presumptuous of me to talk about economic history and especially of Commonwealth countries in the presence of Professor Bakchi over here. But I would, it comes to sort of a discussion about Commonwealth countries in particular and economic history more generally. But the reason I focused on Central Eastern Europe is in part because the environment in which I operate, the academic environment in which I operate, just has, I have access to greater resources about Eastern Central Europe than possibly, because it's so much research has happened, especially not just during the post-transition period, but also sort of when the Soviet system existed, there was immense interest in that system and so on and so forth. So there's a huge amount of research that has happened and a huge amount of documentary evidence that is available. And so it's just how to put it, a very sort of it's easier for me to access that, and whereas of course in the case of Commonwealth countries in particular, I obviously have access to Indian scholars who can I can talk to and I can learn from. I mean, I cannot do that, for example, necessarily for the French colonized countries. I do not have the same amount of access, but I do have some level of access within Eastern side. So it's very much a, how to say, issue of what is easier for me to do. But I must sort of, one thing that I'll mention is that the data that the World Bank has collected is from 1996, because that's when this project came on steam, and sort of they've been collecting data ever since. But as I sort of showed in sort of what my sort of at this stage that my thinking about the framework is about, or the integrated framework is about, I have to go back much further in history, right? For example, to sort of look at what determined the nature of the sort of the ruling coalitions, and then what happened, like how who are the constituents, etc. How did they emerge, right? What are the difference? How do sort of, let's say, the nature of the rulers and constituents in Central European countries, which seem to be doing much better, let's say, than the other Eastern European countries. How did they differ and why? Right? I have to do that, so I have to go way beyond the 1996. I have to go back in history, but in terms of just demonstrating that, showing from the data that given that these countries had started not from exactly the same point from a historical standpoint, but some common point of political sort of system and some common point of economic system, right, which had dominated for periods of 50, 60, 70 years. Right. So and we sort of see either persistence or divergence, but it could go up or down. There's no particular sort of reason to argue that it will definitely improve over time and so on. It just data to highlight, to make a case or motivate the case rather than sort of make the data part of the analysis itself. Now, where I do intend to make the data part of the analysis is to say that given the historical context, given where what we know about these countries, in a sense, if we sort of say that good governance is governance, the metric above a certain threshold, let's say, and I could choose that threshold in an arbitrary manner or ad hoc manner, right? Then the question is that, as I said, are there different pathways to getting to that? Right now, because and I intend to use a particular methodology called qualitative comparative analysis, which essentially sort of says is that you can get from point A to point B in, say, along multiple different pathways, right? So along pathway A, let's say, or pathway 1, there could be a combination of factors A, B, and D, right? So that sort of takes you there. In another case, it could be C and F, which gets you somewhere, to the same outcome, right? And that I find is much more sort of meaningful than to talk about a regression analysis where you get the marginal effects of, certain things or the other based on cross-sectional variations. Because I'm not interested so much in whether, let's say, any factor X has a positive marginal impact on governance or not, right? What I'm interested in is that suppose I don't have that. Does it mean that I'm not going to reach, right? How do I get there from point A to point B? That's what I'm trying to understand, right? So that's where I'm going to use the data as well. But my story would definitely not start in 1996.
Now, Zakir, may I ask a question? Professor Bhaumik, it was a wonderful presentation. I learned a lot from it. I know that any metric is very difficult. Economists are still debating even how to really measure GDP, how much do you give weight to ecological destruction and so on. So in the case of governance, it's also very difficult. Given that, I have two questions. One is, not a green country. It is one of the most vibrant democracies in the world today. It has been able to send the scion of the biggest conglomerate in the country, Samsung, to jail for fraud. It has been able to send its next prime minister to jail for corruption. And it has done in the pandemic one of the best. It has one of the best records in the whole world, along with New Zealand and Vietnam and one or two other places. That is one question. The second is, metrics going to give a greater value to the governance of Poland and Hungary than to that of Argentina or India? And why? Because in both these countries, they have made it impossible for opposition parties actually to come up. They have gone backward in denying rights to women, to LGBT. And in those contexts, of course, India is also going a little backward, but Argentina is going forward. It has given more rights to now to women and to LGBT. So can you answer these two questions, please?
I must, to begin with, I must say that, I am not by a long shot an expert in the the histories and as the sort of the context of countries like Argentina or South Korea, for so. And so it would be very difficult for me to talk about specific contexts and why this particular matrix talk about those, say, as to be having lesser governance quality than certain other contexts. Now, I, the one thing that I would have to say that uh, if I take South Korea as a case in point, I mean, I think that if we take the question about government effectiveness, and if you talk about you mentioned the reaction to the COVID-19 pandemic and how South Korea has dealt with it, right? Now that has a lot to do with the government effectiveness, right, and the capacity of the state to manage these kinds of scenarios, right? Um, and I haven't presented the data on that. I do not remember offhand where South Korea lies with respect to government effectiveness. But I would imagine that I'd be surprised if they don't sort of do rather well in that particular metric. Now, I have chosen to sort of arbitrarily, I must say, report two different metrics over here. One is voice and accountability, and the other is rule of law, right? Um, and again, I would be very careful not to sort of make sort of specific judgments about where South Korea or Argentina, etc. lie. All I can say is that as I was answering to, I think to one of the questions, earlier questions, is that if we talk about vibrant democracy, we also have to define what a vibrant democracy is, in the sense that is casting votes necessarily the measure of a vibrant democracy? I'm not 100% sure about that, right? So then, along that, where do we sort of draw the line and say that this is a vibrant democracy? If we say that people having a voice is necessarily a metric of that, I would have to go back and sort of check whether in any particular context, even if that's counted as a sort of a democracy in a nominal sense, whether that would necessarily has, for example, voice. And when I talk about voice, for example, you mentioned LGBT groups, you mentioned sort of other constituents in a country, etc. So all their voices are not necessarily heard in a similar way, right? And so there is a asymmetry between how certain groups are heard and how certain voices are heard and not certain others. So uh, the short answer is I do not know. Again, I sorry for this, Professor Baxter, but I do not know enough about the individual context to talk about that. Right. I'm sort of for the moment trusting the data. As I mentioned in my presentation, huge amounts of questions can be raised about all these different matrices, and I'm aware of that. Right. And it has been sort of discussed in the literature. But the question is, what is it that we can run with? What data can be run with? Right. Because, for example, if I wanted to talk about democracy, there are other measures that from Freedom House and so on, which are where we sort of classify countries according to weak democracy, strong democracy, et cetera, and so on. And I can do a correlation between that and sort of voice and accountability, right? But both are indices, both are constructs, right? I'm basically going to find correlations or not between two different constructs. And that in turn will raise a question about, whether either or both constructs are correct or not. Right. So I don't see an easy way out of this. I mean, the best I can do is acknowledge upfront the difficulties and challenges with this matrix that we are going to use, right? And whether or not they are going to necessarily represent the way that we view particular context or individual context, right? But hope that on the average, and when we look at distributions and the sort of the means and medians of distributions, they would give us something to talk about. This is not a satisfactory answer, but I mean, would you be able to live with that for the time being?
First of all, Sumon, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, thanks a lot for such an enlightening discussions. So I know that you are not interested to find out any causal relationships or anything, but you said or you ended that just for the sake of convenience and you have much more information, you would like to concentrate on East European countries, as you pointed out.
Mm-hmm.
And also you finished by saying that you would like to look at the historical perspective and it keeps coming that the historical information and all these things are required, even if you do not want to do the regressions, but just to form the matrix in other dimensions as well. So I just would like to know from, because you have done some analysis and you would like to do further some analysis, is it the case, like if in the history of evolutions of the country, there exist the ethnic divisions and conflicts, which sort of created an environment for the politicians to have an opportunist behavior, which created a kind of polarizations and sort of majority versus a kind of minority. And that sort of rule out the improvement in certain indicators of the governance. That, can that be a cause that the countries which are having more such kind of ethnic diversity and the conflicts in the history, that could give you, and again, I do not want to draw a causal relationship, that can have a kind of, certain interesting relationships with the lower degree of the governance. Maybe that is also true for the Eastern European countries.
Okay, so first, let me give you some data, right? If you look at the, Harvard has a database on ethnic fractionalization, which goes back to the 1910s or 1920, I think, for most of
Yes.
the countries, right? Now, if you look at it, you will find that at the time when the former sort of Soviet bloc countries, if I put that generally, in 1989, where they sort of started their transition process, um, the Eastern Central European countries, which is basically Central Europe and the Balkan countries and so on, they were hugely homogeneous. If you look at the ethnic fractionalization, they were hugely homogeneous, whereas the former Soviet republics were not. Right, their degree of homogeneity was much lower. Now, first of all, we know that that itself is a construct, right? Because for example, if you're Bulgaria and you are let's say part of Soviet bloc over, but you are still in a sense a sovereign country, and Romanians didn't necessarily move from Romania into Bulgaria and settle there, etc., right? Whereas if you are part of Ukraine, there was a huge Russian migration into Ukraine, from Ukraine to other parts of to Russia, to the other republics, etc. So that sort of changed the nature of ethnic composition. Just to give you some data. Let's move to different contexts. You take sort of a large number of countries in sort of the colonial countries that Indro was mentioning, especially in the African context. You'll see that their lines and boundaries have been drawn arbitrarily. It's basically straight lines, through certain boundaries, right? Now, suppose that has created a scenario where you have two rival ethnic groups in a country, right? And they're now the way that I look at it, and this is where I sort of go back to the what I call the evolution of the state, right? So
Yes.
in this particular case, the state is an artificial construct in that context, which didn't evolve organically, right? But which evolved because a colonial power drew the map in a particular way, right? Now, the question that happens is that if there is two ethnic groups historically have never accepted each other's domination. So there was no, as in North and his co-authors talk about, that there is some kind of when the natural state evolves, there is some kind of a coalition building among the elites of the country, right? To sort of say that, okay, we are not going to fight amongst each other, right? And we are going to sort of protect the country from the rest of the world, etc., right? And this is the basis of the social contract that we have with the citizens of this country, etc., right? Now, that doesn't happen if you arbitrarily draw a map. Now, if the elites have had no historical sort of coalitions built among them, and they do not accept each other's domination, then the problem is that, one, the state itself may not have legitimacy in the eyes of the people, because they are still thinking in terms of their maybe tribal ethnic identity, maybe in terms of their ethnic identity, etc., etc. That's the sort of natural basis of legitimacy for them. right? This arbitrarily drawn boundary of the state has no meaning for them, right? And if, let's say, government, and if they vote according to their ethnic identities, so that at any one time, either one or the other can get into power if they're roughly of the same size, or if one is much larger than the other, then they necessarily always get into power because of because of their size. Then the problem that can happen is that that government would never have legitimacy in the eyes of everyone within the country. Because I'm ethnic group A, you are ethnic group B, right? This time
That's
ethnic
so
group A has won the election, but ethnic group B had never signed up to the fact that they will be ruled by ethnic group A. A boundary was drawn, they are in that situation, they are having to live with it. Right. And I like this argument of Binmore a lot, that essentially where that these contracts that we have within the country have to be self-enforcing. And in order for that to happen, there has to be this understanding at some level, right? That if I play by the rules, you will play by the rules. I know that you know that you know that I know that, and Indro knows about this way better than I do. So I'm not, he can, talk about it for hours, I'm sure. But the point is that I like that argument. And therefore, I like tracing things back, I would like to rather trace things back to see what is where does that legitimacy, what is the source of that legitimacy, both in
yes.
terms of the groups that are within the country, the elites within the country, the nature of the state itself. Does the state have legitimacy in itself, and so on, right? So
Then, yes, then if that is the case, then you cannot just concentrate your analysis with only homogeneous in that aspect, only with the homogeneous countries. So you might have to have the other countries as well, which you just mentioned,
yes.
where the yes,
Yes, I mean, I can say that in 1989, this happened to be the ethnic fractionalization of the country, right? I have to ask the question is, one, how did that come about? And two, does that sort of make the state more or less legitimate in the eyes of the people, a state and the governing elites?
anyway, thanks a lot, Shuman. I really like that presentation. And in
I mean,
the
by the way, I'm also looking for, as you can imagine, as you I'm sure have figured out, this is ongoing research. So any comments that you think will help me, I really look forward to that. Sure.
Uh, well, you see, there is I mean, Professor Bhaumik has covered so much ground and given so much enlightenment to us that it is childish to ask more of him. But I think along with the positivist analysis, there should also be some kind of normative analysis. What is the quality of life that these particular countries enjoy? People enjoy the kinds of questions that was raised by Amartya Sen
Hmm.
and that have been developed in the UNDP report.
Hmm.
Let us take the United States. It is a country which enjoys good government by every criteria.
Hmm.
And yet we have two major movements during the last 2-3 years. One is Me Too,
Hmm.
another is Black Lives Matter.
Hmm.
And the people who have been involved in these two movements are not yet happy that the United States has actually moved very far in that direction.
Hmm.
And the recent Democratic Convention, in fact, said that the current president is destroying American democracy.
Hmm.
Now, in your governance analysis, can you bring in any of these questions at all, or do you have to remain on the positivist ground?
Okay, since you invoke Sen, so I'm sort of very tempted to go back to my favorite in this case, which again I think would be to Indro's liking because it's been. There's a very compelling argument. He has this parable of a slave trader, right? And the argument that he makes is that he basically picks a fight with Rawls, which is, of course, a basis of what a lot of what Sen or has to say, right? Or the theory of justice kind of argument. He says that, look, if I have to create a normative sort of scenario, right? Then what I have to say is that the social contract that we come up with, should be from our, from behind from our original positions, from behind the veil of ignorance, right? And that essentially assumes that I know that I may. So the example of that is that I will want social security or social insurance if I know that someday I may lose a job, I may become destitute, and in that case, social insurance will protect me as well, right? So if I think in those terms, I can obviously think about it, right? The question is, what if the die has already been cast, and I belong to, say, a landowning rentier class, right? So then the question is, would I ever view anything from behind the veil of ignorance, right? And if I don't, right, and then he sort of quotes Hume and argues that in a Hume's famous quotation, who will police the policeman? So I can always make a commitment, but what is the sort of device that would hold me to my commitment? Why can there not be a deviation from my commit exposed, right? What is there to prevent that? Right. So therefore, I mean, and why I'm saying this is he therefore essentially picks a fight with the sort of roles, in a sense, the straw person of the sort of, how to put it, the normative part of the discussion, as you're putting it, right? And I'm sort of trying to debate in my mind as to how far we can therefore push the normative argument, in the sense that if we think of it as a social construct, and that construct is shaped by where we are right now in terms of our endowments, in terms of our norms, in terms of everything, right? So how can we sort of come to an equilibrium that is, and it is equilibrium precisely because we have all accepted it in some way. But what if that equilibrium is not, consistent with a normative view of the world that I have? Would I then say that I would still like to abandon this equilibrium, but how do I guarantee that there will be a new equilibrium that embraces the normative part? I mean, I do not have. This is what I'm one of the things that I'm grappling with, and I'm looking both at you, in terms of say, if you have any suggestions for me. I'm equally sort of looking at Indro, because I mean, he knows game theory way more than I do.
One point here. You see, my norm does not have to be imposed on anybody.
Okay.
Democracy, I just expressed that norm.
Mm-hmm.
What is wrong with Rawls is that he wants this norm to be applied to other people also.
Mm-hmm.
In his Law of Peoples, he says that you respect only the rights of countries which have decent governments, which
Mm-hmm.
means that you support George Bush's attack on Iraq, saying because this country does not have that kind of governance. Now, Iraqi people have not done anything wrong. And this is why the Law of Peoples is actually a misnomer for that book. It should have been called the Law of States, the Law
Okay.
of Geopolitical States.
Okay.
Is normative judgment is actually a dictatorial judgment.
Okay.
That is how I look at it.
Okay. Indra, any suggestions from a purely game theoretic point of view or mechanism design point of view?
Well, very difficult to model this, as you know. So it all depends on how you model it. So that's I think I wouldn't even dare. No, honestly, I mean, if somebody wants to model it, then it is a different ballgame altogether. But it all depends on how you model it. I mean, we always make comments. I'm not blaming you. I do the same as well. We always make comments which are quote unquote loose and not very precise unless we have a specific model. It is true that there are lots of things you talked about, can be modeled as a, let's say, repeated game or evolutionary game or whatever. But unless you have a specific boundary, uh, it's difficult, and that's the main difficulty to how to model, because there are lots of issues. You invariably will think about hundreds of issues. You cannot put everything together. You already have touched on many things in your talk, um, and now Professor Bhakti in his discussion also mentioned important things. Monisha also talked about disability. I just wanted to combine Professor Bhakti's and Monisha's question. If you think about it, Professor Bhakti mentioned Black Lives Matters and Me Too, but if you go back few more years, uh, all other important issues, women rights, LGBT, abortion, all those things are big issues in the developed world. UK, USA, Australia, Canada, Ireland. It's a completely different ball game when you have minority rights and developed countries. For example, you said you don't want to find the causality for the developed world. Whether it's chicken or egg comes first, we don't know. Again, it will depend on the model. So I'm sorry, I cannot really help unless we really sit down and think of a model. So mm.
Well, thanks very much, Zahir, again, Zakir, rather, for inviting me. It was a pleasure, and I haven't seen. I get to talk to Monisha often, but I haven't seen Indro and Professor Bhakti for a long, long time. Professor Bhakti for not for 25 years, maybe, and Indro again, not for 10 years, possibly. So it was good to see both of you as well.
But you are good. I think you are the neighbor. No? In that sense, Indra and you. Yeah, I'm reducing the spatial dimension. But yeah, okay.
You
Okay.
Is it possible to get hold of any of your recent papers relating to this?
Professor Bakshi, I am working on a manuscript for a monograph that I promised to a publisher on governance issues, and especially with respect to with focus on Eastern Central Europe. So, hopefully the monograph would be done by early next year. Then that would become available. Yeah.
oh, that's good. It probably needs a monograph, not a paper.
I think, as you said, that to write a paper, I would inevitably have to set boundaries in order to make things tractable,
Yeah.
right? But I just wanted to take a sort of a broader sweep than that, and so I thought that the monograph way is a better way to go, possibly.
Thank you, Jackie. Thanks a lot for organizing such, nice presentations and informative ones also. And thanks, Moushumi. Bye.
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 Thank you.
Bye, Indra.
হ্যাঁ, বাই মনীষা।
Bye.
হ্যাঁ,
Bye.
দেখা
Bye,
হবে।
everybody.
হ্যাঁ, দেখা
হ্যাঁ,
হবে কবে?
হ্যাঁ, হবে। দিদি বলেছে অক্টোবর থেকে আসতে দেবে।
ওকে ওকে, তাহলে তখন দেখা